It's late, I'm tired, I can't feel my legs, and my brain goes, let's film a video. Hi everyone, my name is Maddie. Welcome back to my channel, or thanks for joining us if this is your first time. I get the vibe this video is going to be very chaotic. I have been painting for the last 7 hours because I'm a psychopath. No, I just got really into it today, so I can't feel my legs because I've been sitting on them for a really long time. I'm convinced the chairs aren't made for me because I feel like every time I sit down at a chair I am too low from the desk and I have to tuck my legs under me in order to be able to function properly. I don't know if that's a real thing or if I made it up. It's also stupid warm where I am for November, so I've been in a tank top and capris all day, which is wild because Canada, and we just had snow 7 days ago, so if people don't say global warming is real, they're crazy. I also still have paint under my fingers, so don't think I'm dying. My skin is not turning blue. I also just ate a blue raspberry Jolly Rancher, so my tongue's also blue. So this is where we're at. But what I wanted to talk to you guys today is about the book Cemetery Boys, which is by Aiden Thomas. I was super excited to read this book since I first heard about it. I actually saw it on Tumblr. I don't know if I follow this account or if I just keep seeing their posts everywhere, but there's an account that posts what new contemporary YA books are coming out. And I heard about Cemetery Boys there, and I also heard about it shortly after it first came out, and Aiden Thomas became the first openly trans author to ever make the New York Times bestseller list, which is super exciting, super amazing. We love that we're getting more diversity out there in the writing world. Plus, the idea of this book just seemed really, really fascinating to me. I don't know a lot about the tradition of the Day of the Dead, but I've always found it fascinating. I don't want to say I've always been obsessed with death, but I've always been very interested in the ways that different cultures have approaches to death. And I think kind of this idea that spirits come back and we get to visit them again once a year is really, really fascinating. And I think it creates a much more open dialogue around death. And I think in a lot of Western cultures, or the way that Mexico is in the West, but a lot of white Western cultures, we kind of teach people to be afraid of death, and that can actually be really detrimental to learning how to grieve and dealing with that process. So I'm always down to read about a book that's going to teach me a little bit more about another culture. I guess I should actually tell you what the book is about. So this book follows Yadril, and I'm just gonna read from the... When his traditional Latinx family has problems accepting his gender, Yadril becomes determined to prove himself a real brujo. So the direct translation of brujo to English is a witch. So I'll get into that a little bit more when I continue with the video. But with the help of his cousin and best friend Maurizia, he performs the Kinses rituals himself and then sets out to find the ghost of his murdered cousin Miguel and set it free. However, the ghost he summons is actually Julian Diaz, the school's resident bad boy, and Julian is not about to go quietly into death. He's determined to find out what happened and tie up some loose ends before he leaves. Left with no choice, Yadril agrees to help Julian so that they can both get what they want, but the longer Yadril spends with Julian, the less he wants him to leave. That's so much of a better sum up than I could have done. Maybe that's why they pay people to write those for the inside of books. Real smart. So, first off, let's just talk about the fantasy aspect of this book, because that is one of my favorite things about it. I feel unfortunately, a lot of YA books are getting to the point where they're just repeating the same kind of I'm thinking kind of Hunger Games, Divergent type series, where they're just basically one person comes up with an original idea and then someone just copy and pastes it over and over and over again until people become sick of it. So it's really exciting to be able to read a book that has, it sounds super mean of me to say an original idea, but something that is interesting and unique. Aiden Thomas draws a lot from Latinx heritage and spirituality to bring that to this book, which is really interesting and like incredibly beautiful. So there's the Brujas and the Brujas. I'm going to apologize if I pronounce anything wrong. I've done research, I've listened to videos where people say things. I do not speak Spanish. My extent of my Spanish knowledge comes from Dora, so I'm just gonna leave that there. But yes, we have the Brujos and the Brujas, and the Brujos, their job is to help spirits get to the other world, and if a spirit is here for too long, it goes maligno, I think is how you pronounce it. But basically the spirit becomes evil, and they're able to sever that tie in order to protect other people from that evil spirit and have it go to the land of the dead. And then the Brujas are and that's a traditionally male role, and the Brujas are the women, or the traditionally female roles, and their job is to heal, and they do that using animal blood. And then each role has I believe it's protege. It's like a talisman, I guess is like the best way I can kind of explain it, but it's basically an item that works as like that tether and connection that they can use in order to use their magic. So it's almost like something kind of like a wand, I guess, is the best way that I would be able to explain it. So for the Brujos, those are traditionally knives, and for the Brujas, they are rosaries. So all of this is really interesting, and it's really keenly developed in the ways that certain people can see and interact with the spirits and the connections that they have. There's also this idea that the magic has been like distilled down throughout the generations, which is really interesting. And then I think one of the other things that's really interesting is the blending of different Latinx cultures. So Yadriel's family lives in this kind of, I don't want to say secret, because everyone knows the community is there and they go to a public school, but they don't know the magic that goes on. So it's kind of this closed off community in, I think it's East or West LA, but everyone in that community comes from a lot of different Spanish heritages, and they all like bring something with it. So the person who forges the knives learned that from his family, who generations ago came over from Haiti, and then that information gets passed down. And even with the food and the cooking, there's all these like different traditional dishes that get brought from people who have backgrounds from different countries, which is really interesting in recognizing that even though I think, unlike fortunately in the general media, everything gets mushed together when you look at Latinx culture. They just kind of assume that it's all the same. This is something I can speak to a little bit from my own experience, where everyone thinks indigenous culture is the same, but in fact there's like countless different tribes and everyone practices in their own unique way. So in order to be able to blend and recognize the differences of those cultures while still recognizing the similarities that they carry in their beliefs was really interesting to have an opportunity to read about. So one of the other things that they talk about a little bit is some of the saints come up, but particularly Lady Death is the person that they go to perform these kinds of ceremonies and kind of be blessed as a Bruja or a Bruja. So that's something that very early on, Yadriel and his cousin go to the statue of Lady Death to ask, or for him to complete the ceremony and essentially ask for her blessing for him to be a Brujo. So just the imagery of Lady Death is really interesting to me, but a lot of the history and the beliefs that go behind that is dealt with really well. This book taught me a lot about like the Day of the Dead. I think there was a lot of things that like I knew existed, but I didn't really quite understand how. Like I've heard about sugar skulls, but it's gonna make me sound like an idiot, but I don't think I ever realized like they were actually made of sugar, because I think most of the time that I've seen them, it's like tacky stores that are selling them, basically like cultural appropriation versions. So to actually like be like, oh, that makes sense that it's a real sugar skull that they decorate by hand is really fascinating, and also just from an artistic perspective, super cool that they can put all that amazing detail into it. As well, the papers that hang down, I learned what those were called. There was a lot of things that I had seen and been able to like recognize from pulp culture or other things that I've read that have representations of Day of the Dead. Things like the Disney movie Coco come to mind, that I didn't quite understand the significance of them or what they were actually called or what they meant. And that was really interesting for me to be able to read and learn about. So I think the fantasy and the cultural aspect is one thing about this book that I really love. Another thing about this book that it does really well is the diversity piece. So, of course, the main character, as I mentioned, is a trans boy, and part of the reason that he's doing these ceremonies on his own is because he didn't have the opportunity to complete them after his 15th birthday like everyone else did, because there's kind of this idea from his family that he's not a real boy, so like why would they try when it wouldn't work, which is really unfortunate. But one of the interesting things is Yadriel is not the only trans character in this book. One of Julian's friends is also trans, and then there's a lot of other representation of just gay and queer people in general, so we love to see that. I think one of the things that's really important, I talked about this a bit when I read Felix Ever After, is dealing with intersectionality, which is this theory that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw that basically looks at the ways that we receive privileges or discrimination based on the intersection of different parts of our identity. So for example, a white male is going to have more privilege than a white woman is, or a black woman might be discriminated against specifically for being black and female as opposed to one of those identities individually. So the example that she kind of uses, without getting into too much gender theory and all of that with you guys, is a factory that hires black men to work in the factory portion, and it hires white women to work up front in the office, but they don't hire black women anywhere. So they're specifically discriminating against black women, both of those identities together as one, if that makes sense. So getting back to the point, I talked about this a bit with Felix Ever After, but it's really important to look at the way that identities such as being a queer individual interact with your race or your cultural or spiritual beliefs, and I think the book navigates this really well because there's often this pull for like holding on to traditional beliefs or traditional ways of viewing things, and that's something in this book that gets discussed is because the traditional rules exist within such a binary within the book that, well, and I think a lot in life that these traditional rules exist within a binary, that there's this idea if you're not one or the other, like you don't really have a place, and being willing to realize that like by shifting the way that we view those traditions, we're actually expanding and improving on our culture instead of seeing it as a negative thing. Alright, what else do I want to say on this book? I'm going to keep this review largely spoiler free. I might do a spoiler version later, but just looking at how long this video is already, I'm going to try and keep it relatively short. I really loved this book. The mystery was really interesting. All of the characters are really unique and dynamic. Another thing that this book touches on that really breaks my heart is like the people who get forgotten. Unfortunately, a lot of times like runaways or people who are kind of seen as like the bad boys or the outcasts like Julian are, when they die they kind of get brushed aside, and that's something that this book tries to address, is kind of the way that society deems some lives as more valuable than others, and how that can have an impact on the way that people view each other. Without, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, but Yadriel and Julian have this really beautiful well, it's beautiful, but it's also really sad conversation where Julian kind of says that he always accepted that he was going to die young, he just didn't think he was going to die as young as he did. And it's really heartbreaking to see that that's something that was internalized in him growing up. This book also does a lot with the idea of being seen, which I think is really interesting. They talk a lot, particularly with Yadriel, and how this pressure and emotional labor is put on him to have to explain to his family his identity and explain to people around him. And when he realizes that that's not, it's not that it's not something that he should have to do, but that it's possible for people to see him without him having to go through this exhausting process of being like, yes, and this is what this means, and this is how I identify, and explaining everything that goes behind it, is really interesting to me, because I think as much as it's important to have the education and that available, it's also important to recognize that people who exist within like diverse identities aren't responsible for teaching you about them. we have the internet. You can go out and learn about it yourself. If you have questions, some people are very open to like being okay with like discussing those questions and things like that, but it can also be emotionally exhausting when you're trying to figure out who you are, trying to be comfortable, doing this super nerve-wracking thing of like coming out to someone and then having to basically act as a teacher for them, which is just a lot. So I think the way the book navigates that and has conversations about it is something that I don't see expressed a lot in other YA literature, which I think is really important to address. Especially, I think a lot of YA literature is doing a better job of looking at the ways that acceptance is not a binary, it's not yes or no, that there's a lot of this gray area where it can be like, well, I'll accept you, but only in like X, Y, and Z scenarios, or I will only accept certain parts of yourself. Yadriel talks about the way that because he is gay and trans, his family was able to accept him being gay better because they saw it as him like still being straight since they were struggling with his gender identity, which I think is really interesting at looking at those ways that those lines of acceptance can get kind of blurred. What else do I want to talk about in this book? I don't even know. It was so good. I read it like so quickly. I was just trying to ingest it. There's definitely like, while you're reading it, you know that Julian is already dead, but also there's this expectation that at some point Yadriel is going to like officially cut his tie and let him go, so that's just a heart-wrenching journey to have to go on. There is so much in this book that just like really hit home with me, and some of like the beautiful quotes and things that get used. Oh, that's something else that I wanted to talk about, is the way that they use language. So obviously, well, maybe not obviously, so both of the characters can speak Spanish fluently, but Julian chooses not to share that a lot, and it's because it's something that's very like intimate to him and a personal memory that he has from his past. I'm gonna leave it there without being too spoilery, and that was something that really hit home with me. I have a very complicated relationship with my traditional language from like my indigenous heritage, because unfortunately some of my relatives made the decision generations ago to not pass that language on due to essentially racism, because they believed that they would be making the lives of their kids and their grandkids easier by having them be able to assimilate better into society, which is really unfortunate because a lot of the indigenous languages are dying right now. So that intimacy of understanding language is not just the way you use to communicate, but something as inherently a part of yourself is really interesting to me. Especially the way when Julian talks about the language and why he only shares it in certain ways. That spoke to something else that I've gone through, where I play violin. I've played violin for, I guess, 12 years now, but the teacher that I had for the longest period of time unfortunately passed away from cancer, and I didn't notice it at the time, but I stopped playing for a really long time, like maybe a year, if not at least a good couple months. And when I finally picked it back up again, I realized that the reason I stopped playing it was because that was the language that we communicated with each other with, was through music and through learning. And it was just really heartbreaking for me to be playing these pieces that she had taught me on my own. So it felt like in some ways that language was unique to us, and I lost part of that when she passed away. So I think recognizing that the ways in which we communicate are more than just the words or the things that we share with one another, and that they run a lot deeper, is something that the book explores really well. And I really appreciate in this book that it's not, they don't spoon feed you what the words are. As someone with like a very limited knowledge of Spanish, I did take French like all the way up until I finished high school. So there was certain sentences just from my like French knowledge and my minimal knowledge of Spanish that I could piece together what they were saying. But I did have to work for it to be able to understand the characters, which I think is something that's really important, because I think a lot of times the effort isn't put on us to be able to like understand, and it comes back to that idea of like having to explain your identity to somebody else. And I like that the book doesn't always feed it to you, because it can in some ways kind of kill that moment. I like that the book just lets the word speak for itself, and you have to do that active effort to go and look up what the words were. It did mean I had my phone beside me the entire time, and sometimes I was like, it's an emotional climax, but I have to like Google Translate what they're saying. But it meant more to me because I understood that they were saying things in their language when it was like something that was like really important to them. I was reading a post on Tumblr last night that was like doing a really interesting analysis of the ways in which the language kind of represents the emotional intimacy between Yadriel and Julian, so that's something that's really fascinating as well. The romance in this book is really sweet and it is really well done. The friendships in this book are also amazing and really well done. There's not a lot of like good platonic male-female identified relationships or friendships, like close friendships, so to be able to have that represented between Yadriel and his cousin is really nice to read about. Also, she's just like a badass, and she's just like, I'm vegan, I don't want to use animal blood to heal people, so no thanks, y'all, and that's just wonderful. I did predict what was going to happen in the end of the book, not entirely, but kind of in terms of like the mystery and figuring out why these people died and what happened. I was able to piece together a little bit, but I wasn't that frustrated with it because it wasn't, I think I read so much that I'm able to like recognize those patterns, but it wasn't super obvious what was going to happen that I was like, wow, I can see this happening from page one. It was more as like the hints were dropped that I was able to piece it together. Yeah, so overall, this is just an incredible book. It does a lot about family, it does a lot about culture and spirituality, it has some great representation, it's an own voices novel, which we love to read about, and overall just, I like waver between giving it 4 and 5 stars. I think I like settled on 4.5, but I should really just give it 5. I wrote down a lot of quotes, I was drawing fan art for it today, I was painting some, and I was posting it online, so if you want to engage with that, as always, my Instagram will be linked down below, but please do go out and support this book and read about it. I guarantee that you will probably learn something, maybe not, I don't know what your lives are, but either way, it is a good story, it is wholesome, and it makes my heart very happy that books like this exist and that I get to read them. If you guys have read Cemetery Boys, please let me know what you thought down below, or if you know of any other really great books that kind of touch on similar topics or ideas, I would love to hear your recommendations. Otherwise, as I already said, my art Instagram will be down below, and my Goodreads and my blog I will drop down below as well. I don't know what I was gonna say there. If there's something, I don't know. If there's anything you want to tell me, leave a comment down below, I guess. God, I hate outros. I never know what to say. So I'm just gonna leave it here with me and my blue tongue, and I will talk to you later.